Hey there. Here to talk to you a little bit more about human impacts, to put humans in the context of the community of species in which we live, and to put humans in the context of our ecosystem, and to talk about human impacts from an ecologist point of view. And so in this lecture we're going to talk about species extinction. And so we worry about species extinction because those of us who study other species and those of us who study ecology have noticed an alarming trend. And this is not something new, this is something that ecologists have been talking about for decades now. We see lots of loss of biodiversity, and we see many species disappearing. And when we put that in the context of long-term changes in species, it's apparent that we are losing species at an alarming rate. And this is a concern to us. And so you can look at many different groups, and in just about any group of animals or any group of species that you study, plant, animal, you see that we're losing lots of these species. And species aren't the kind of thing that you can just get back once you've lost them, right? We have these fantasies of preserving the DNA and ultimately resurrecting these species, and those are pretty much fantasies, okay? Jurassic Park is not a real thing. And so that's why we're concerned. If you look at 3% of the plants we've lost, or they're at least threatened with extinction, 12% of birds, 21% of mammals, so that's our group, 29% of amphibians. Again, if you look here in Kentucky or Tennessee, a huge percentage of like the freshwater mussels. So just about any group you study, you see that we've lost tons of those species and we can't get them back. And that is a big concern for ecologists. I'm a fish guy, and nearly 1 in 3 U.S. fish species are extinct or on the brink of extinction, right? 1/3. That's something that bothers a lot of us. And so here in Kentucky, you talk about fish, we've got some endangered species right here in western Kentucky. The pallid sturgeon is a fish that I've worked with before. Very interesting, very unique species, but in tremendous danger of going extinct. Just west of Murray, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, is the Relict Darter. And this is found in Jackson Creek and Bayou de Chêne over in Graves County. That's the only place it's found in the entire world. You've got a very small stretch of stream where you find this very rare fish species. And it would be very easy for something terrible to happen and completely wipe this species from extinction. So this is not just some sort of abstract concept. We've got species that are in danger of disappearing right here in western Kentucky. And so as always, we want to try and put things in context. And if we look at the fossil record, we can see a general increase in diversity as new species evolve over time. But we've recognized about 5 major mass extinction events, which are indicated on this graph here. And so there's been about 5 times in the Earth's history where we've seen huge numbers of species disappear in a short amount of time. Most of those have been tied to global changes in climate, and so earlier we talked about climate change, so that's one of the concerns with climate change. If you look at the most recent extinction, that's when the dinosaurs disappeared. That's probably due to an asteroid hitting the Earth, down off the coast of Mexico, what's Mexico now, and that again caused a large-scale changes in climate. So that's the most recent mass extinction. If you look at the data on species extinction right now, these species extinction rates we're seeing are as high or higher than we've seen in these mass extinctions events. So we may be in a 6th mass extinction event, but whereas those earlier ones were caused by large-scale global phenomena, this most recent extinction is probably due to, probably again, global climate change is probably one of the factors, but it's due to one species. It's due to humans. It's due to us. And so here's a figure from your book, kind of just trying to illustrate that. And this is there's tons of different lines of evidence looking at species extinction rates, and we're taking the 10,000 foot view in this class. We don't have time to get into all of these, but you can see that the rate of extinction in these bird groups and mammal groups has gone up has gone up quite a bit in the last 100, 150 years. That is an incredibly short amount of time when you're talking about ecology or evolutionary biology, and to see these species disappear so quickly is quite troubling to ecologists. And so it also begs the question, well, why do we worry about it? It's pretty clear that we are losing species at a very high rate. But is that a problem? Why should we care about it? Well, I'm going to give you some basic arguments why we are concerned about species extinction. The first are selfish reasons. We call them economic reasons or selfish reasons. The first reason that we want to protect these species and we don't want to lose them is that we can benefit from these species. But if we lose them, then we can't benefit from them. And so, for example, you can look at the genetic qualities of many species and like agricultural species, right? So there are lots of traits that other species have that would be beneficial for us to use in our agricultural crops. For example, you can get a virus-resistant rice crop by crossing it with a wild population that has virus resistance. Earlier we talked about like BT corn. We talked about organisms that have resistance to certain parasites, and we bred that into corn, and now the corn has resistance to those parasites. There's innumerable examples of this where the wild populations or other species have these qualities that we would like to use and that we would like to breed into our crops. Well, if we allow those other species to disappear, we cannot use those genetic qualities. Another example of selfish reasons to protect species. In the United States, about 1/4 of all prescriptions contain compounds that originally were isolated from plants. So plants produce tons of compounds. Plants can't run away from their predators. And so they use chemical defenses. And lots of those chemicals have properties that we can use and would be important to us for like medicine. And so a common example here, the rosy periwinkle is a plant that has many compounds. And there's a compound coming from this plant that might be useful in protecting us against cancer or useful in the fight against cancer. Lots and lots of the drugs we use were discovered from other species. So that's another good reason to protect these other species, is that we can find things in those species that benefit us. Another selfish reasons or another benefit that we get from other species are things called ecosystem services. And so there are things that intact ecosystems do that greatly benefit humans. But if we destroy those ecosystems, we don't get that benefit. And so there are all kinds of processes that these natural ecosystems do that help sustain humans. So for example, purification of air and water. wetlands and plants and plants from other ecosystems help to treat water and to treat air and to remove impurities from them. And, you know, we don't need to argue the importance of clean air and clean water. Well, there are many ecosystems that purify air and water. You know, and I'll talk about wetlands quite a bit, but wetlands are very important for this process. The detoxification and decomposition of waste. You know, what happens when you flush a toilet? Where does that waste go? It has to be treated so that, you know, it doesn't, those wastes have to be decomposed and that water has to be treated so that we can reuse that water. And the treatment plants that we have can't do that on a large scale economically, but these ecosystems can break those wastes down, and they provide that service for us. The cycling of nutrients. We've talked about how nutrients cycle, but for nutrients to cycle, they need to be broken down. And so for us to be able to get fertilizer to put back into agricultural crops, a lot of that needs to come from the, you know, breakdown of other existing decomposing organisms. Well, other species do that for us. Moderation of weather extremes. So you can look at things like, again, the plants that live on the coast that absorb the energy of storms and hurricanes, right? And you can measure how the loss of such plants increases the intensity of the hurricanes further inland. There are all kinds of these examples of ecosystem services that are provided by intact ecosystems and that argue for the preservation of those ecosystems. And so again, we talk about things like treating water and removing nutrients and other things from water to give us clean drinking water. It's cheaper to buy and preserve wetlands than it is for us to treat that water ourselves. And so protecting these species and protecting these habitats and protecting these ecosystems has many direct benefits for humans, and that's a good selfish reason to preserve them. Another reason to worry and to worry about species extinction, the evolutionary reasons. So you again remember when we talked about communities and how these species are closely related, and the removal of just a single species can have cascading effects throughout the entire species because they've all evolved together. And so, you know, the extinction of a single species may have radical effects throughout the community and influence many other species. That's another reason, you know, we can't always predict what's going to happen if we allow a species to go extinct. You remember we talked about just removal of the top predator, the starfish, from this particular community that we discussed here. You saw several other species disappeared just because we removed that one species. And so there's other examples where removing a single species can have cascading effects. There's a lot of concern about the loss of bees and other pollinators here in North America. And so you remove those species, well, they're important for pollinating all kinds of other plant species, including lots of crop plant species. If you remove those pollinators, then all these other species are going to be affected by that. You remember this example of a complicated marine food web. And again, just removing one or two of these species might lead to the extinction of several others, or might have cascading effects throughout that entire ecosystem. We talked about how the removal of wolves actually ended up, you know, when you got rid of the wolves in Yellowstone Park, you saw plants that disappeared. Unintended consequences, right? The wolves, the removal of wolves allowed elk to expand, and the elk fed upon the seedlings of these plants. And so again, you you can't always predict what's going to happen if you allow a species to go extinct. These communities are like an airplane, right? This is a metaphor that's commonly used when talking about this. Species are like the rivets that hold the airplane together. And so maybe if you lose one or two rivets, the plane is still able to fly. But if you keep losing rivets, eventually that plane is going to crash. But if you lose one or two critical rivets, that also might cause the plane to crash. And you don't always know which rivets are the most critical. And so it makes a lot more sense to protect all those rivets or to protect all those species, because you can't predict what's going to happen if you lose them. Another reason to worry about species extinction: ethical reasons, simple ethical reasons or moral reasons, right? Other species have a right to exist. You know, we're a species just like all these other species on the planet. Do we have a right to decide which ones live and which ones die? Other species have a right to exist. And future humans have a right to experience unaltered nature. And so I think these are also good reasons to protect species. It's ethical to protect them. And it's unethical to allow species to disappear for our benefit, or for us. It's unethical for us to cause other species to disappear. Okay, well, so that's sort of the why of protecting species. Like, why is it important to worry about species extinction? Let's talk about the how of diversity loss. What is causing these species to go extinct and this loss of biodiversity? And most of this is traced to human activity. Well, all of this is traced to human activity. But there are four major threats to biodiversity that we can identify: habitat destruction, introduced species, overexploitation of resources, and pollution. So these are the ways that humans are impacting these other species and causing the loss of biodiversity. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So there's a figure from your book sort of indicating and outlining these different threats to biodiversity. Excuse me, again, let's go back to this graph we looked at earlier. Human population growth, right? We are in this exponential phase of population growth, and even though the growth of the human population is starting to slow, because we have so many people, the size of the population is still growing. And so we have a tremendous number of people on this planet. And so we are having a disproportionate effect on other species. And one of those threats is the loss of habitat, right? And so this is probably the greatest influence on other species: human alteration of habitat. And so they're just again, if you're an ecologist, you're familiar with there's so many examples of this. In Wisconsin, prairie occupies less than 0.1% of its original area. And it's similar in Illinois. Illinois used to have these huge prairies, and they're all gone. About 93% of the coral reefs have been damaged by human activities. And we talked about how coral reefs are so important to that marine ecosystem. There's so many species that depend on those coral reefs. I work a lot on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River has been channelized and dammed and radically altered. And that completely changes the aquatic habitat. Kentucky Lake and Barkley Lake, these are great lakes, and we love to use them down here, but they, once was the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. They were very different habitats. We've radically changed that habitat. Again, I talk a lot about wetlands. Most wetlands have been drained and otherwise destroyed. Here in Kentucky, it's about 80%. Up in Illinois, it's 90 or 95%. Used to be 1.5 million acres of wetland in Kentucky. Now there's about 324,000 acres. Again, those have been drained and converted to agriculture, and on and on and on. And so there's just myriad examples of natural habitat that no longer exists because humans have altered it. Another way that, so habitat alteration is the number one way that we're losing lots of species. Another threat to biodiversity is introduced species. And so introduced species, there's different terms for them: exotic species, alien species. These are species that are introduced from a different ecosystem, that humans have moved to new regions. And they often, many times they become what we call invasive species, and they have a disproportionate effect on this community to which they're introduced. And there's lots of reasons why these introduced species can become invasive, but they often don't have native predators or native parasites, native pathogens, and so they don't have a lot of those things that help to control their population in their native range, and so they can spread rapidly. And they very often can disrupt this new community. And so this is called coevolution, when you have lots of species that have evolved together for a long period of time. So again, those tightly knit relationships we see within communities, that's because they've all co-evolved to one another. And so when you bring a new species in from a completely different area, that species has not co-evolved. And so it often has nothing to control it, and it also has a very disruptive effect. Classic example of this down here in the south is kudzu. And so you can drive anywhere down here during the summer and you can see scenes like this. Now this kudzu was brought over originally to try to help with erosion. But it's not native, it doesn't have any native predators, and so it grows unchecked, and you can see it's very disruptive. So you drive around anywhere here in the south and you can see this kudzu just covering other plants. Species I've mentioned before, species that I work with a lot down here, silver carp, or the Asian carp. There are several different species, but silver carp is probably the most disruptive. And we talked about how silver carp can be very disruptive for a typical aquatic food web, because they eat phytoplankton and zooplankton. They eat at the bottom of the food web, but they don't have any parasites. They don't have any natural predators. They're also very prolific. And so all that energy that gets fixed by those algae in that aquatic food web, all that energy at the bottom of the food web goes straight to this one fish and doesn't go anywhere else, because there are no natural predators. And that's having an extremely disruptive effect on the aquatic food web. This particular species is also one that is disruptive because it has this unique behavior where when startled, it likes to jump out of the water. And so this is a example of silver carp, and they're being startled by an electrofishing boat. But this is very disruptive for our species, because if we're out there trying to enjoy the aquatic ecosystem and these things are flying around knocking you out of the boat, that can be a problem. This is a invasive species that we are really concerned about down here. Okay, another, again, way that humans are threatening biodiversity is through overexploitation. And so that's simply using wild plants and animals at rates that are unsustainable. And so we talk a lot about managing these different populations so that we can have a sustainable population, so that we can, it's nothing wrong with harvesting or using these other species. You know, we're part of this community, and that's what predators do, is we eat other species, but it's the it's taking them too much so that it's unsustainable and the populations crash. And again, we have tons and tons of examples of this. An example that I'm very familiar with are Atlantic cod. There's used to be a huge Atlantic cod population off the northeast coast of the United States. They used to be able to catch them by the bucketful, literally. Like ships would just lower buckets and then raise them up, and they would have cod in them. They were so prolific. And so it was an intense fishery for years. It was very important to the establishment of the United States, but they were not well managed. It was not managed as a sustainable fishery, and as a tremendous collapse, and now there's basically no Atlantic cod anymore. And so you can look at different stocks of cod, and you can see when industrialized fishing really became popular in the 60s and 70s, you see enormous drops in the cod stocks. And you can look at cod landings going back 100 years, but you can see in the last part of the 20th century, enormous drop-offs in these cod because they were overfished, they were overexploited. Now you can start to think about the cod in the context of their community, and you can start trying to predict, well, what are the cascading effects? Again, removal of a single species can have effects throughout the entire community. And so what do you think happened? The cod are the top predator in this community. Once the cod disappeared, what do you think happened? Their prey increased. There was reduced competition, so the cod were able to rebound because they had less competition. The cod competitors increased, so other species that competed with the cod were able to increase. Or the price of cod dropped, so cod fishing dwindled. So once the Atlantic cod were overfished, they're the top predator, so there was nothing controlling their prey. So their prey numbers increased greatly. And so a major prey of the codfish was the spiny dogfish. Or their prey increased, but a major competitor of the Atlantic cod is the spiny dogfish. And so now the spiny dogfish don't have to compete for food with the Atlantic cod, and the prey numbers are increasing, so the spiny dogfish numbers increased and replaced the cod as the top predator. And so, since there were no more cod, the fishery switched to spiny dogfish. But these were also poorly managed. There was no control over how much they could be harvested, and so they were over-harvested, and the spiny dogfish collapsed. And so then the fishery switched to herrings. No more cod, no more spiny dogfish. They switched to herring, which is lower on the food web. And so, there's more energy down at the lower food web, but of course this is not, herring is a very different fish. It's not the same kind of fish, but that's what the fishery went to and drove those herring numbers down. This is called fishing down the food web. It's a common phenomenon in fisheries. The point being is that all this overexploitation, all this unmanaged exploitation reduced these numbers and had these cascading effects, and because there was not proper management, the fishery just kept switching and got lower on the food web and kept driving the numbers of all these different species down, and completely changed the complexity, completely changed the complexion of this community. And again, it was because it wasn't because they were harvested. There's nothing wrong with harvesting and using these species, but they were over-harvested. They were not properly managed. And so in fisheries, again, I'm a fish guy, so I talk a lot about fisheries, but this is where we see a lot of this. There are lots of wild fish populations that have been improperly managed and overfished, and that's leading to the extinction of a lot of these species. Lake sturgeon in Lake Erie. The catch of lake sturgeon dropped 80% in 10 years. And so there's an enormous drop-off of these sturgeon. And they're, lake sturgeon are one of these species that are just now, we're starting to slowly rebound. That was, over 100 years ago. The North Atlantic bluefin tuna population decreased by 80% in 10 years. That's an enormous crash and drop-off. So here's a lake sturgeon. This is one of my grad students holding a lake sturgeon. We've done some work trying to study these fish and restore them. Again, they're a really cool, really interesting fish. They were completely decimated in the upper Mississippi River. They were considered a trash fish, so they were just, anybody that caught one would just throw them up on the bank. They were not managed. They were not valued. In fact, they were used to power steamboats. They would burn lake sturgeon to power steamboats. and also with the radical habitat alteration, the building of dams and things in the Mississippi River, these were extirpated. They were removed and no longer found in the upper Mississippi River. But these fish, have a value, and so we've been trying to restore them and get their numbers back up and protect these species. Again, the tuna is a big problem. They're poorly managed, and their numbers are dropping because of overharvest. Okay, the last way we want to talk about, again, ways that humans are impacting biodiversity is through pollution. We talked about this with climate change. That's one way that pollution is affecting all species, and we talked about other things like nitrogen and sulfur that get released into the air and to pollute the air. But there's lots of ways that humans pollute ecosystems. All economies pollute. All economies and all human civilizations create waste. And so releasing that waste into natural ecosystems is pollution. And we do not do a good job of counting that cost and of controlling that pollution. And just a simple example that you find around here is eutrophication of aquatic systems based upon excess nutrients. So when you think about pollution, we often think about smog and smoke and dirty things, and that's all pollution. But the release of things like nitrogen and phosphorus, just excess nutrients, that's also pollution. And it causes this phenomenon called eutrophication. And so here we can look at the drainage basin of the Mississippi River, right? It's an enormous drainage basin. And here in Kentucky and in Illinois and Iowa, we're right smack dab in the middle of this. So things that we do in the terrestrial part of this area end up washing into the rivers and end up in the Mississippi River and ultimately end up in the Gulf. And so lots of our agricultural runoff ends up down in the Gulf. And so here's a graph looking at the concentration of nitrate in the water. And so you're looking at several different rivers in the Mississippi Basin. And in the yellow, you're looking at the nitrate concentrations in the early part of the 20th century. And in the blue bars, you're looking at the later part of the 20th century. And you can see that nitrate concentrations were much higher later in the 20th century in all these river basins. So we're putting a lot more nitrate, which is a form of nitrogen, which is a nutrient that is getting into these aquatic ecosystems. And here's a graph looking at the nitrate flux in the Mississippi River over the last part of the 20th century. And you're also looking at the blue line, which is stream flow. And if you look at stream flow goes up and down, but it's relatively steady. We're not getting any more runoff into the Mississippi River, but we're seeing lots and lots more nitrogen in the form of nitrate in the Mississippi River. So we're putting more of these nutrients into the Mississippi River. Where's that coming from? These are all the sources of that nitrate into the Mississippi River over that 50-year period. And you can see that most of these are relatively steady. Legumes and pasture are increasing, but fertilizer runoff from agriculture is the number one source of all that, and that's where all this excess nitrogen is coming from. And so the point is that this agriculture, these things that we're doing up here in the Midwest and in the South, is ultimately impacting the Mississippi River, which is ultimately impacting the Gulf. And so you get nutrients like nitrogen that get into the Gulf. That stimulates the phytoplankton, and you get more phytoplankton and you get more productivity down in the Gulf, but it's too much of a good thing. All that stuff eventually dies and decomposes. And when it decomposes, it sucks up oxygen. And so what you have is the agricultural practices we have up here are ultimately leading to low oxygen levels down in the Gulf, and it's called the Gulf Dead Zone. And it's just to illustrate how all these ecosystems are connected over a landscape and how just like with climate change, activities in one part of the globe can have effects on another part of the globe, and we have to count those costs. And so this excess nutrients that are getting into the water, stimulating productivity, that's called eutrophication. And eutrophication leads to hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. And so those low oxygen levels then, lead to death of organisms that live down at the bottom, like fish or like shrimp. And so then that has an effect on the shrimp fishery down in the Gulf. And so here's an example of a graph of oxygen levels down at the bottom water, down there where the Mississippi dumps into the Gulf. Here's another graph kind of showing you the same thing. And the red areas are areas where you have low oxygen levels. This is called the Gulf Dead Zone. Again, the point being is that pollution that gets into the waters up here has this effect down south. That's a cost. That's a cost of what we do here in the Midwest that we have to acknowledge relative to the oxygen levels down south. And again, there are fisheries and shrimp fisheries down there that depend upon that oxygen. So, these are things that happen. We just have to acknowledge the effect that we're having in other parts of the world. And this is true everywhere in the world. The humans are impacting habitats and are having this influence on all these other species in myriad ways. We can't ignore this. And so another factor, another way these things are all linked, is the loss of habitat. So I mentioned that wetlands are extremely rare anymore, and this is a type of habitat that has been lost up here in the Midwest and up here in Kentucky, up here in the southeast and the Midwest. Well, that combined with the excess runoff is what's leading to this eutrophication down in the Gulf. We convert those native wetlands to agriculture, and those native wetlands and native prairies to agriculture. We add excess fertilizer, and we don't have those wetlands to capture those nutrients. That's part of those ecosystem services I talked about. Those wetlands typically are there to capture the nutrients from that runoff and sequester it in the wetlands. And so then it cleans that water, and so you don't have those nutrients making it to the Mississippi, and you don't have that stuff running down to the Gulf. But if you destroy those habitats, you don't have that ecosystem service, you've got all those excess nutrients. All these things are greatly related, but they're all related to human activity. And so, this is why, again, protecting and restoring habitats, critical habitats like these wetlands. This is the Emiquon Wetland Preserve in Illinois I did some work on, but we've got other people here at Murray that are working on preserving wetlands here in western Kentucky. That's why these things are important. We can see the value if we drain them and turn them into agriculture. There's a certain value there, but we're ignoring the costs that go along with that. These intact ecosystems have a value that's important to us as well. Okay, so again, we just wanted to talk about the effect humans are having on habitats and species, and why we should protect these species and habitats. We must acknowledge the impact that we're having on these other species, and we've talked about how all these different species are closely interrelated. And so impacting these species can have unpredictable, cascading, wide-ranging effects. And it's necessary that we acknowledge the value that these habitats and species have. And that's the problem here. We don't value them. And so I want to, try to show you how interesting these species are and how interesting these relationships are, and try to convince you that they do have a value. And there are many reasons, again, why we should protect these different species. There are selfish reasons, because we can get things from those species and they provide ecosystem services for us, and that's not a bad reason. That's okay, right? But we gain things from these other species. That's why we should protect them. They're evolutionary reasons, right? All these species have co-evolved, and by removing a few of them, you can have these disruptive effects. And there are ethical reasons. These other species have a right to exist, just like we have a right to exist. And so an ethical stance would be one that acknowledges the benefits and acknowledges the value of these other species and accepts that it's important for us to protect them. And so I think those are good reasons to protect species. I don't think there's any question that we are having a disproportionate effect on other species on this planet. And these are the responsibilities of our species, to acknowledge this and to do something about it. And so that's all I've got for this topic. As always, let me know if you got any questions. It's starting to get a little chilly out here, so I'm going to go have a cup of coffee and warm up. So y'all have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.